Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're going to be tackling, a pretty controversial topic, I guess you could say. We're going to be looking at President Trump's proposed plan for Gaza.
Right.
And we're basing this whole deep dive off of a recent CBS News article.
Okay.
And honestly, it's a plan that's been raising eyebrows all over the world.
Yeah, it's definitely generating a lot of buzz.
So, for our listeners maybe who aren't totally familiar with everything that's going on with this situation, can you just kind of give us a breakdown of what Trump's plan actually is?
Sure. So basically, Trump is suggesting that the U.S. takes control of Gaza and turns it into what he's calling like a Riviera.
Riviera.
And this would involve resettling Palestinians who currently live in Gaza to neighboring countries without the right of return.
So, I mean, when I think Riviera, I think of like luxury and beaches and resorts and stuff.
Exactly.
How does that translate to the reality of what's going on in Gaza right now? Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, Gaza right now is facing a humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
They have very limited access to like basic necessities like food, water, healthcare. Their economy is struggling, and there's always this threat of violence.
Right.
So to transform that into some sort of like thriving tourist destination is going to take a monumental effort.
Huge.
Not to mention a ton of money.
And I mean, this resettlement element, like you said, no right of return.
Yeah,
I mean, that seems like a major sticking point, particularly given the history of this conflict.
It is a huge sticking point.
Yeah.
The right of return for Palestinian refugees has been like a foundation of every peace negotiation for decades.
Yeah.
To just take that away could be seen as like dismissing a fundamental Palestinian claim.
Yeah.
And honestly, it could even make tensions worse.
Yeah, it's like you're trying to build a house on like a really shaky foundation without addressing those like really core issues like displacement and the right of return. It feels like any plan, no matter how ambitious or well-intentioned, is probably
gonna crumble.
Yeah.
Exactly. And just to make things even more complicated, Trump has also suggested that he would withhold aid from Jordan and Egypt if they don't cooperate with this resettlement plan.
Which, I mean, those are two really key allies.
Huge allies.
In the region.
Yeah.
So that seems like it could have some pretty major diplomatic repercussions.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially considering that Jordan already has something like over 2 million Palestinian refugees.
Wow.
So asking them to take even more, even temporarily, could just overwhelm their resources and really destabilize the country.
And they've been pretty vocal. I mean, Jordan has opposing the plan, right?
I have. I mean, they've said that they're concerned that this would put the two-state solution at risk.
Which, for our listener, just to clarify, that's basically the idea of establishing like an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel.
Right.
As like the basis for like a long-term peace agreement.
Exactly.
So Jordan's basically saying that, taking in all these refugees without a clear path towards like a Palestinian state would just make that two-state solution
Much harder to achieve.
basically impossible.
Yeah.
And Egypt, I mean, they haven't been quite as vocal.
No, not as vocal.
But it seems like they probably have some reservations about it, too.
Almost certainly for similar reasons.
Right.
And, both Jordan and Egypt have historically played a really important role in these peace talks between Israel and Palestine. So their cooperation is going to be really important for this to work.
And speaking of key players, King Abdullah II of Jordan just happened to be visiting the White House.
Oh, yeah?
Right in the middle of all of this.
What a coincidence.
Yeah. And this was like his third meeting with Trump.
Wow.
Since the inauguration. So it definitely wasn't just like a quick courtesy call or anything.
Yeah, there was definitely something going on there.
Right. And it wasn't just with Trump either. He met with a bunch of other top officials.
Yeah, he met with Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
Right.
National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. Middle East Envoy Steve Witkoff.
Wow.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and even some lawmakers from both parties.
It sounds like a lot of pressure in those meetings.
Oh, yeah. There's no way around it.
Especially considering the kind of mixed messages that are coming from the Trump administration.
Right.
I mean, on the one hand, you've got Trump praising Abdullah, calling him a great man, saying he's got a good heart.
Yeah.
But then you have this plan that Jordan has totally rejected.
Right. Like, how do you even respond to that?
Yeah, it's like a really tough spot to be in.
It really is. It just goes to show how complicated this whole situation is.
Yeah.
I mean, Jordan has this long-standing relationship with the U.S.
Right.
But they also have to look out for their own interests.
Of course.
And right now, those interests are clashing with Trump's plan for Gaza.
And then there's this whole thing about the resettlement being temporary. Like, it seems like the administration's sending some mixed signals about that.
Yeah, it's not very clear.
Yeah.
I mean, Rubio and the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, have both said that it would just be a temporary thing, mostly to help rebuild Gaza and make it into this Riviera.
Okay.
But then you have Trump saying that Palestinians wouldn't have the right to return.
Right.
Which sounds pretty permanent to me.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty big contradiction.
Yeah, and it raises some questions.
Right.
If this is supposed to be temporary, who's going to pay for all this rebuilding?
Right.
Trump said the U.S. won't be paying for it.
Yeah.
So where's the money coming from?
And what about, like, the U.S. military? Like, what role are they going to play in all of this?
It's not clear. They haven't really talked about any of that.
It's all pretty vague at this point.
Extremely vague. And that's unsettling, not just for the countries involved, but for the Palestinians who are going to be directly affected by this.
Yeah, and to make this even more complicated, we've got this ceasefire in Gaza that's basically hanging by a thread at this point.
Yeah, barely holding on.
Hamas is saying that Israel's violating the truce.
Right.
And they've already stopped releasing hostages?
They're not happy.
No, and this ceasefire was supposed to be like
Right.
a step towards de-escalating the situation.
Exactly.
But it seems like it's going in the opposite direction.
It does.
And actually, just as we were recording this, we got news that Trump issued like this ultimatum to Hamas demanding that they release all the hostages by the weekend.
What?
And he's threatening to start fighting again if they don't.
Oh, boy.
So it feels like we're like right on the edge of another major conflict here.
It's like a powder keg just waiting to explode.
Yeah.
And it just highlights how messy this whole thing is.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got all these high-level diplomatic talks happening.
Right.
While at the same time, there's this really dangerous situation on the ground in Gaza.
It seems like any little mistake
Right.
could have some really serious consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
Not just for the people in Gaza and Israel,
Right.
but for the entire region.
Yeah, this could have ripple effects all over the Middle East.
Definitely. It really puts things in perspective, right? Like when you hear about these grand plans and all this talk of, turning Gaza into a Riviera, it's easy to forget that there are
Real people.
Yeah, actual people whose lives are going to be affected by this.
It's so important to remember that.
So, I mean, we're throwing around these terms like ceasefire and hostage releases.
Right.
But what does that actually mean for the people who are living in Gaza?
They-
Like, what are
What
their...
are they going through?
Yeah, their hopes, their fears, like what's going on in their minds.
Those are the voices that often get lost in all the political noise.
Yeah, and those are the voices that are probably the most important to listen to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have to understand the Palestinian perspective, their concerns, their aspirations for the future.
Right. And I mean, we've talked about how Jordan and Egypt feel about this plan, but what about the Palestinians themselves? Have we heard any reaction from, like, Palestinian leaders about how they view this proposal?
Yeah. I mean, most of the reaction has been negative.
Yeah.
They see it as an attempt to take away their basic rights, especially that right of return.
Right.
And they feel like it's a solution that doesn't really address their core issues.
Which makes sense given the history of this whole conflict.
Oh, absolutely.
For our listeners who might not be, totally up to speed on that history.
Right.
Basically, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been going on for decades.
Decades.
Rooted in displacement, broken promises, just a ton of mistrust on both sides.
Yeah, it's a really deep-rooted conflict.
So any attempt to fix it has to acknowledge all of that.
Exactly.
And that's where I guess this worry about the two-state solution comes in.
Right, because Palestinians are worried that this plan would just give Israel even more control over the territories.
Right.
And make it almost impossible to create an independent Palestinian state.
So it's not just about, like, the logistics of moving people around. It's about their future as a people.
Exactly. Their right to self-determination.
So then the question is, if not this plan, then what?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Like, what are the alternatives?
What other paths are there to peace?
And, I mean, that's a question that people have been trying to answer for...
Forever.
Yeah, decades.
It's a tough one.
It is, but it seems like any solution that's actually going to work has to deal with the root causes of the conflict.
Absolutely. You can't just treat the symptoms.
Right.
You have to get to the heart of the problem.
And that requires, I mean, it sounds cheesy, but...
I know what you're going to say.
It requires, like, dialogue and empathy and...
A compromise.
Yeah, a willingness to compromise from everyone involved.
It can't be one side dictating terms to the other.
Exactly.
It has to be a genuine effort to understand each other's needs and aspirations.
Which is really hard.
Oh, it's incredibly hard.
Especially with all the mistrust and animosity that exists.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but you're missing half the pieces. And in this case, those missing pieces are the voices and the perspectives of the Palestinian people.
Their right to their own homeland, their right to live in peace.
Exactly.
Just like anyone else.
And until those rights are recognized and respected, any solution is probably going to fail.
So when you really break it down, this whole thing with Trump's plan,
Right.
it's about way more than just rebuilding Gaza.
Oh, yeah. It goes much deeper than that.
It's about land identity, security,
Self-determination.
all those really core issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Exactly. And those aren't issues that you can just solve overnight
Yeah.
or with some top-down plan.
It seems like the Trump administration might be missing some of the nuances here.
Yeah, some of the historical and political complexities.
And yet,
It makes you wonder if they've really thought this through.
yeah, I mean, even if we ignore all the diplomatic hurdles
Right.
and the potential for more violence, just the logistics of resettling that many people.
And rebuilding Gaza.
Yeah, and making sure it's stable in the long term.
It's a huge undertaking.
And that's not even mentioning the money. Like,
Right.
if the U.S. isn't going to pay for it, who is?
Exactly.
And are these other countries even willing to contribute to a plan that they don't really support?
It's like building a house on sand.
Yeah.
Without a solid foundation, the whole thing could just collapse.
And in this case, that collapse could have some really bad consequences.
Oh, yeah.
Not just for Gaza, but for the whole region.
It could destabilize the entire Middle East.
And we can't forget about the human cost.
Of course not.
I mean, we're talking about potentially uprooting millions of people.
Taking them from their homes, disrupting their lives.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is.
It's a reminder that behind all the politics and the strategy, there are real human beings who are going to suffer because of this.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff.
Right?
But we can't forget about those individual stories.
Those are the stories that really matter.
And those stories remind us that we need a solution.
We need a real solution.
That's going to bring peace.
A lasting peace.
One that lets everyone in the region live with dignity and security.
And hope for the future.
Yeah. So much to think about. So, I mean, we've looked at, all the details of Trump's plan and kind of where things stand now. Where do we go from here?
Yeah. I mean, if you take a step back and look at the big picture, I think it's pretty clear that this plan, whether it works or not, has really shaken things up.
Yeah, it feels like we're at like this turning point.
Definitely. It's like somebody just threw a wrench into the whole peace process.
And now it's like, wait, what happens next?
Nobody knows.
Like, is this going to lead to something good or is it just going to make things worse?
It's hard to say. It's like one of those choose your own adventure books.
And the stakes are pretty high.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're talking about people's lives, the stability of the entire region.
The possibility of even more conflict.
Exactly. It's not something to take lightly.
So, I mean, what are some of the scenarios that could play out?
Okay, so one possibility is that Trump's plan actually gains some traction.
Even with all the opposition.
Yeah, maybe they make some changes, some compromises.
And they get enough support to make it happen.
Right. But honestly, I don't think that's very likely.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much skepticism.
Yeah, and a lot of legitimate concerns.
Okay, so what's another possibility?
Well, the plan could just fail.
Like it just falls apart?
Right. Either because other countries don't support it or because the violence in Gaza flares up again.
And then what? We just go back to how things were before.
Basically back to square one.
Which isn't really a solution.
Not at all.
So is there like a third option?
Maybe. This whole thing could force everyone to rethink their approach.
Like come up with something completely new.
Exactly. Something that goes beyond the old frameworks.
Something that actually gets to the root of the conflict.
Right. A solution that's fair to everyone involved.
That would be amazing.
It would, but it's a long shot.
Yeah, it feels like a really long shot.
But hey, it's not impossible.
True.
And that's where people like our listeners come in.
What do you mean?
By understanding this conflict, by learning about the different perspectives.
We can actually make a difference.
Exactly. We can start having more informed conversations.
We can ask our leaders the tough questions.
We can push for solutions that prioritize peace and justice.
Yeah, it's not about just sitting back and watching this all happen.
Right. We have to be active participants.
We have to use our voices.
And that's why these deep dives are so important.
Yeah.
It's about giving people the knowledge they need.
To make a difference.
Exactly.
So to everyone listening, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for a peaceful future.
Because even small actions can make a big difference.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
We'll see you next time.